Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today is going to be a little bit different of a video, and it's going to be a year review for the year 2022 in the Digimon trading card game. So basically what I'm attempting to do is kind of just break down my thoughts on how this year went, both in my performance and then what I noticed about the game in 2022, both good and bad. And then I'm going to be going over some of the metadata that I was able to collect, going over each of the different metas from each of the different sets that was released, and then kind of give my overall thoughts and takes on the year as a whole. So with all that said and done, let's just see my overall performance. So how did I feel like I did this year? So this year compared to last year, I did notice I got less tops. The competition is getting more fierce, which is pretty good. But I did, compared to last year, end up getting my Nationals invite, and I am going to Nationals, which was a huge plus compared to last year. And then I did see a lot of solid channel growth over the course of the year, so my channel as a whole is still growing, which is showing that the game as a whole is still growing, and then there's still just a lot of interest in the Digimon trading card game. Next, let's go over my negative thoughts on some of the worser things that happened over the course of the year. So the two big things is they had some really poor quality control. There was just lots of poor translations and erratas that needed to be made, more specifically with EX3, but we did notice the trends that there was just more and more errors getting printed and slipping by, which is definitely not something we want to see as a whole. And then the other negative is kind of something I had going last year, but this year really cemented it, where they just have a really poor release schedule. So for whatever reason, EX sets and BT sets are not on the same cycle. They're on two completely different cycles, and this creates like this whole feast or famine situation where we'll literally have either a 3-month gap in between sets, which is totally fine, or a 1-month gap in between sets, which is a little bit less fine. Like, if they really wanted to, they could just look at all of the products that they're going to be releasing the year and then just round it out. So we should theoretically be seeing a new set every 2 months, which I think is perfectly fine. So I think that they really just need to get a control over their release schedule on top of any delays that happen, but I'm not necessarily holding the delays against them per se, considering we did see less delays this year than we did last year. But as far as my more positive thoughts, we did see an uptick in events. There was just more events being played, which again shows that there's more interest in the game and more people are playing the game. We also saw the rise of in-person events, so there was more in-person events to go to that were larger. Most of them were kind of tied to conventions. Then on top of that, like I stated before, the game is continuing to grow, and we do notice that they are caring more and more about the game in a more active ban and restriction list. So we got a total of 11 cards banned or limited this year. Most of them were limited to one. We only got one really true ban out of the whole year, which was pretty decent considering I think that the game is still pretty fun and exciting, and the more active they are in banning and restricting their cards, the healthier the metas that we can get. Sometimes we saw with BT10, they were a little bit too trigger happy, and they could have paced and weighted it a little bit better, but they didn't exactly know how the cards that would be impacting the English meta versus what they did in the Japanese meta. So I think that not necessarily having different ban lists, but just figuring out and playing a little bit more patiently might be a little bit better for them. And if they already know they want to ban and limit something, then they could easily make a snap announcement for it. But regardless, so far, 2022 was a pretty decent year as a whole. So, talking about competitive events, so we had basically EX1 starting off this year. There was really no EX1 events to really write home about to gather data for outside of Nationals, which we don't really have that data. So I'm just going to be starting things off with the BT7, but Nationals was technically at the start of this year. So I have a little key here on as far as how I'm going to be breaking down the different tiers as far as their overall meta representation inside of the top 16s for their overall meta. I think BT10 was a little bit scuffed in terms of the data just because we did have a split and fragmented format where we were playing with restrictions for a little bit and without restrictions for a little bit, so that was kind of weird. But for the most part, this is just the deck's overall representation in the meta in the top 16. Some decks might have performed a little bit better than their actual placing or a little bit worse, but this is just showing off just some quick representative data as far as the overall health of each of the different formats. So, starting things off with BT7, we had 5 different events for BT7, and as far as the number of decks that was represented, we had a total of 10 decks being represented in the top 16s throughout those events. That is a little bit small, but that's just because there was less events, but regardless, the fact that through all 5 of those events, Blue Hybrids was 55% of the meta, really shows how strong and oppressive Blue Hybrids was, really limiting and suppressing the viability of what actually could be played inside of BT7. The second best deck is going to be Yellow Hybrids because, again, based on Japanese data, those were the 2 best decks, and they were still the 2 best decks for our format, even with the ban of Mega Digimon Fusion to hurt the Susanoo combos, on top of the limitation on Ice Wall and Reinforcing Memory Boost. So they were still the forerunners of the format, and I really don't think that this was a super healthy format as a whole, just because of how oppressive hybrids were at the time. At the time, there was no way to actually interact with tamers, so basically the hybrid decks just played their tamers and basically just sat and waited to punish the opponent for literally doing anything. Blue hybrids just took advantage of Digimon being on the field, which is, at the time, how a lot of Digimon decks wanted to play. They just wanted to have some Digimon on the field, and Blue Hybrids basically denied them from actually utilizing their Digimon and punished them for having Digimon. Yellow Hybrids didn't necessarily fall into that category, but the amount of healing and recovery that the deck had, on top of just being able to, again, like Blue Hybrids, take advantage of all of the memory that they had access to, just created really powerful push turns that you just couldn't do anything about. So security control was basically dead in the water because, well, they couldn't control anything. Beelstar at least has a little bit more of an aggressive game plan, but that just goes to show that certain types of decks being super prominent can suppress or basically eliminate other types of decks from being even competitively viable. Next, going into BT8, BT8 was a pretty interesting format. People like to equate it as one of the better formats, and I don't necessarily disagree. At the beginning is the big caveat. So we saw a huge dip in Blue Hybrids, and Yellow Hybrids started to emerge better just because the amount of people that were playing Blue Hybrids also just wanted to try to play Armor Rush and Imperial. The amount of people wanting to play Yellow Hybrids also might have wanted to try to play Mastimon a little bit, but I think Mastimon fell more into that purple player category. But regardless, the fact that we had 3 pretty decently strong decks, and the meta was a little bit more diverse with 12 different decks being represented, showed that there was an improved health with all of the new decks that were playable. The only problem was that towards the end of the format, a lot of players realized after they started messing around with the new decks and they weren't performing as well as they wanted, they just went back to the hybrid decks towards the end, and hybrids still kind of started to take the meta just because there was really no way to still interact with hybrids. We did see a little bit of Black War, but Black War and the DNA possibilities weren't enough to truly suppress hybrids' overall strength and competitive viability at the time, which then led us into EX2. So EX2 was basically BT8 2.0. It just picked off where BT8 left off, with not a whole lot of EX decks being competitively viable. We saw a little bit of D-Reaper success and a little bit of Beelzemon success, but for the most part, it was just what was good in BT8 just continued to be good in EX2. And this was exacerbated by the fact that we already learned towards the end of that format and at the beginning of EX2 format that hybrids were just still the best thing to be playing, so Blue Hybrids just saw more and more play and started dominating the meta after a certain point. But it didn't stop the Imperial players from wanting to play Imperial, just because it was still a pretty fun combo high damage deck compared to everything else that was being played. And again, yellow hybrids fell just because blue hybrids was always good into yellow hybrids, so it kind of helped suppress that and those types of decks. But I'm pretty sure that if EX2 were to continue, blue hybrids would have ended up seeing more of a dominant meta share. But we still had a pretty decent turnout with 15 different decks being viable in EX2, so people were still trying to figure out and play around with what we can do to try to counteract the hybrid menace. Which then leads us into BT9. So BT9 was, again, a more diverse format than people might have realized. So as blue hybrids, it basically fell off the map. It didn't completely go away, but it was severely limited in its overall success just because of the big meta change. So with the blue hybrids basically being gone, it opened up the doors for a lot of other decks to be more competitively viable, and thus, as a result, we did end up seeing more decks end up getting into the top 16. BT9 was the longest format of the year. We had a lot of time with this format, and there was 14 large events that this data was taken from. So it shows that Metal Garurumon was the top deck of that format, but I know Alphamon actually was the best performing deck of the format, just because it had a pretty good matchup into Metal Garurumon, and on top of that, it had higher placings on average than Metal Garurumon. But Metal Garurumon had a larger representation, which is currently what's being shown. But as far as Metal Garurumon's overall dominance in the meta, it wasn't as large as what blue hybrids were, which some people would think, oh, 3 formats of blue hybrids was pretty bad. We currently have 3 formats of Metal Garurumon, but Metal Garurumon stays at this relatively consistent low 20% rate compared to blue hybrids, which only fell in BT8 because people really didn't want to play that deck anymore. But regardless, the fact that the big meta change from Digimon wanting to be on the field to hiding and raising and comboing out really hurt the overall impact on what blue hybrids was as a whole. Yellow hybrids also started seeing less success just because decks were starting to be a little bit higher damage, so they had the ability to actually deal with how yellow hybrids wanted to play, and yellow hybrids also was going under a lot of experimentation thanks to the new Rise X antibody cards compared to the Shikuamon stuff, compared to just utilizing red-yellow hybrids as a whole. So yellow hybrids just didn't exactly know what version was the best and what it wanted to be. But regardless, just a lot of these high damage decks were starting to emerge out of BT9 just because the X antibody mechanic made a lot of these decks stronger, just because they were also more consistent than some of the other decks, having the ability to not only have access to Cool Boy for some extra memory generation and card draw, but you also had Digimon that digivolve on top of themselves for 0, adding more cycling into the deck than some of the other decks had already. So that goes into their overall success rate and why they started emerging as some of the more dominant decks. Mid format, or I guess late format, we did end up seeing the Tommy and Jet Sylphie hit, which did again hurt the overall impact and competitive viability of blue hybrids and yellow hybrids respectively, but it was due just because those decks were super oppressive, and just because the meta shifted to where they're not doing as good as they could have doesn't mean that it can't shift back into their favor. So Bandai just wanted to take that time and liberty to be able to hit them while they were already down. Which then leads us into BT10. So BT10 was definitely a very, very, very messy time period just because, again, we had more cards being banned and limited. So Shout 4 was limited, Sunrise Buster was limited, and Doru Greymon was also limited, mid to late BT10. So we only had 4 events with it not being limited and 3 events with them being limited. So we could see that in general, Metal Garurumon still was the better deck, but if we look at the final standings comparing the 2 different segmentations of the meta, Metal Garurumon actually was being suppressed due to Alphamon and Crosshearts just having very good matchups into Metal Garurumon. So when those 2 decks basically went away, then Metal Garurumon was basically left unchecked to run away with the rest of the format. But there was still a decent amount of health and variety in the format, with a good amount of decks being playable. Unfortunately, when the meta did shift, we did see a shift in what decks were competitively viable, just because some of the decks that were preying on the Cross Hearts decks, which were in decent enough numbers, no longer were competitively viable because they had a pretty bad matchup into some of the other decks. And that kind of echoes throughout that format, which is why it just devolved into BT9 2.0 once those new limitations were in effect. Which then leads us into the current format, which is EX3. So with no more competitive events happening for EX3 and the next competitive season being literally next year, with Nationals assumed to be BT11, this is just kind of what EX3 is looking like as a whole. I already covered it in the tier list, but that was more focused on the English version, and we did have some various other events for various other regions to kind of help add some extra data points into what the meta actually looked like. So Metal Gurumon still was the dominant deck, but again, if we looked at all of the other different metas and its overall representation, it again stayed around that 20 to 25% representation, and if it wasn't for that ban and limitation, I'm pretty sure Metal Gurumon actually would have had less representation in BT10. But regardless, Metal Gurumon is what's defining the EX3 format, and what's playable is shaped and warped around Metal Gurumon. So Bloomlord, Security Control, and Wargreymon all were pretty decent decks to take into that, and then they had their own sets of good and bad matchups, which is what let everything else exist, and this was definitely one of the more, I guess, healthier formats, with more competitive decks being viable. Granted, the majority of them were on a lower level, so they were more in the got lucky or rogue category, but still, just the fact that it shows that there is still a lot of variety, even though people think that this is basically just OTK format, means that this actually isn't as bad of a format as people might have imagined. So the misconception about BT9 being all OTK formats is a big misconception. Yes, a lot of these decks are high-powered decks. They can deal lots of damage, but most of the time, they don't actually OTK. They try to deal as much damage as they possibly can or punish the opponent, so there is different lines of play that these decks can and do generally take when enough pressure is put on them or they're put into an advantageous or disadvantageous situation. But the fact that all of these decks aren't OTK decks is just showing that it is just a misconception, and the game is healthier than people might have realized from more of a competitive meta perspective. So as far as my big takeaways from this year, Blue was really super dominant this year. We had, out of the 6 different metas, Blue was the top deck through basically all of them, except for BT8, with the Yellow Hybrids being the dominant deck for that current time period. So Blue did have a pretty strong grip on the meta, but I do think that Melga X was not as bad as Blue Hybrids was in terms of the meta perspective, just from looking at these numbers. There was more decks being represented, there was lower percentage on Melga's representation compared to Blue Hybrid's representation, so it shows that Melga, while 3 formats of Melga being the top deck isn't necessarily the best thing in the world, wasn't as bad as Blue Hybrids being the best deck for basically 3 formats in a row as well. But the thing that I kind of noticed while looking at all of these different metas is that decks are actually staying more relevant longer. So no more is the time where we get a deck, it's only going to last one format, and then we have to pitch it for the next new hotness right away. Decks are getting updates, decks are having better longevity, just because the damage ceiling isn't as high as it once was, and it's not continuing to climb as high as a bar as it once was in the past. But that's just because last year the game was more forming itself, so it was just building those building blocks and building upon them. So of course you're going to have bigger scopes in overall power creep, but this year wasn't necessarily as bad. The 2 big instances of power creep obviously comes from BT9 and BT7. BT7, out of all of the banned and restricted cards that we got this year, 5 of them were from BT7, so that does speak to the overall power and strength of what BT7 had and what BT7 gave us. But BT9, who's to say, isn't going to have as many, if not more, just because X antibodies as a mechanic seems to be really, really strong. The big takeaway between the two different mechanics is the level of interactivity that they have an offer to the game, or lack of interactivity that they have an offer to the game. So there is less a form of counterplay to be able to stop X antibody decks and hybrid-based decks for their respective metas. But I do think looking ahead at some of the Japanese data and the Japanese formats, we are getting more ability to be able to respond to those style of decks. So it's definitely going to be a really interesting year in 2023 when we actually start seeing all of the stuff that we've been seeing in Japan applied for the English language and the English version of the game, just because, again, we do play the game differently, so their data isn't necessarily representative or indicative of what's going to actually happen for us, especially pending any further bans and limitations, or cards that we didn't see that they had at those given times. But I don't necessarily think that 2022 was a bad year. There was some good, there was some bad, but that's just any given year. But I'm really enjoying my time with Digimon, and the next year is going to be another really exciting year, and I can't wait to see what's going to actually happen. So that's all I really have for this video. As always, feel free to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below, and down in the description below are a couple of different ways you could support me and the channel. So I do have a TCG Player affiliate link, so when you use that link to buy cards off of TCG Player, then some of that money will go to supporting me and the channel. I also do make and sell playmats over on Overcard Gamers on Facebook, so when you buy a playmat with my design, then some of that money will also go to help supporting me and the channel. And on top of all of that, I do have a Twitch account over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, so giving me a follow and a subscription also helps support me there, and I do play Digimon on top of various other games on that platform as well. So thank you everyone for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next video.